Graham Ellison hadn't expected a neon orange violation notice to change everything, but the moment he read it, he knew there was no going back. The Echo Pines Homeowners Association, led by Patricia Langford, a woman who treated community bylaws like divine scripture, was demanding he remove his grandfather's old aluminum fishing boat from his lake, not request demand. Within 48 hours, or pay $500 per day in fines. They even threatened to tow it at his expense. What they didn't know was that Graham owned that lake, not just the water, but the entire lake bed, and a 30-foot buffer around it passed down through 3 generations. The boat wasn't just a boat. It was a piece of history, a floating memory of quiet mornings, family summers, and the man who taught him how to be still, long enough to hear the world breathe. Graham had moved out to Echo Pines for peace, following years of running logistics for a national supply chain company. What he got instead was a smiling tyrant in yoga pants issuing threats about aesthetic violations. But Graham didn't yell. He didn't argue. He opened a binder. He installed cameras, retrieved land deeds, called in an old college friend turned environmental attorney, and started documenting every move the HOA made. Patricia thought she was dealing with another passive resident. What she got instead was a strategist who treated her HOA like a hostile corporate acquisition. He didn't threaten. He prepared. And in that preparation, Graham drew a line in the sand, not with signs or speeches, but with quiet, calculated action. The kind that didn't just defend what was his, but dismantled the illusion of control, brick by bureaucratic brick. The morning after the notice, Graham drove 30 minutes to the county records office with a black coffee in one hand and his grandfather's property folder in the other. The building was quiet, tucked between a faded post office and an abandoned hardware store, the kind of place no one thought to question until they had something to lose. He didn't need to dig far. The records confirmed everything he already knew. The lake was his, not just the surface water, but the submerged bed, the shoreline, and the surrounding 30-foot easement. His grandfather had bought the land back when it was still pasture and pine, long before the word subdivision had been uttered in the county. Graham snapped photos of the deed surveys and legal descriptions, each document stamped and time-worn, each one a quiet scream against the HOA's manufactured authority. But he didn't stop there. He went home, opened his laptop, and started cataloging. First came the Echo Pines HOA website, clean, polished, and deceitful. Our lake appeared in multiple headers alongside event banners for paddleboard yoga, wine and cheese regattas, and a spring bass tournament, all with photos clearly taken from his side of the water. One even showed a handmade bench he'd built with his father, tucked under the pine trees. They weren't just trespassing. They were branding his land as theirs. He cross-checked HOA newsletters, some archived by a forgotten link, others saved in online forums by frustrated residents. Over time, the language had shifted from shared lake access to HOA-regulated property. It was slow, deliberate erasure. That night, he installed motion-activated cameras along the tree line and near the dock, not to hide them, but to make them visible. A silent message. You're being watched now. By the end of the week, he had enough to build a case, not just of trespassing, but of a long-term campaign of misrepresentation. Patricia Langford, wasn't enforcing the rules. She was rewriting history. Graham didn't get angry. He made a spreadsheet, and like every supply chain failure he'd ever solved, he planned to expose the bottleneck and break it wide open. Graham didn't expect allies. People in HOA communities tended to keep their heads down, choosing silence over confrontation. But word travels fast when someone refuses to fold. Within a week, 3 neighbors each from different corners of the community stopped by under casual pretenses. A borrowed wrench, a question about septic permits, an offhand remark about the orange violation notice on his dock. He paid attention to the hesitations, the side glances, the way voices dropped a notch when Patricia Langford's name came up. The first was Larry Chan, a retired park ranger who lived at the edge of the cul-de-sac. He spoke in clipped, careful sentences, but handed Graham a printed newsletter from last year one that promised residents increased lakefront enhancements, which conveniently included the unauthorized picnic shelter, now bolted into Graham's tree line. The second was Vanessa Clark, a middle school art teacher. Her tone was friendly, but her eyes betrayed something harder. She quietly admitted she'd received 5 HOA warnings in 3 months, every one for cosmetic violations that her across-the-street neighbor with identical features never heard a word about. The third was Dolores Harper, 82, a widow who had been living in Echo Pines since it was just gravel roads and survey tape. She didn't say much. She just handed Graham an old plat map with her late husband's annotations and said it might be interesting reading. By then, Graham knew what he was building wasn't just a case, it was a coalition. He created a secure, shared drive, uploading everything: deed scans, photographs, HOA documents, screenshots of contradictory language on their website. He added a private forum invite only. By the end of the second week, there were 12 members. What unified them wasn't just frustration. It was pattern recognition, targeted fines, uneven enforcement property, intimidation tactics. And Patricia Langford, always at the center, her signature at the bottom of every violation. Her name floated in whispers at the mailbox. Her smug face front and center at every HOA newsletter photo op. Graham gave the forum a name: Stillwater Ledger. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about keeping score. And slowly, the neighborhood started remembering something the board had worked hard to make them forget: that the lake didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to him. It started with a flyer, glossy full color, and dropped into every mailbox like a political ad. Echo Pines Future, a vision for tomorrow. It read in sweeping cursive. It featured digital renderings of boardwalks, paddleboard rentals, and premium Lakeview amenities. Graham's jaw clenched when he saw it. The sketches overlapped precisely with the boundaries of his property. Picnic areas laid over his fire pit kayak racks anchored to the dock his grandfather built. There was no mention of his name, no mention of ownership. Just vague talk about community, access, expansion, and long-term recreational planning. He checked the metadata on the digital version posted online. The document had been created weeks earlier, long before the violation notices began piling up. This wasn't a policy change. It was a campaign. Digging deeper, Graham found minutes from the last closed HOA board meeting. Buried 3 pages in was a vote authorization to begin negotiations with a private developer named Lake Forge Group. Their intent was clear: purchased the lake outright from its current controlling interest. Only there was no such interest. He owned the land, the lake bed, and 30 feet beyond the shoreline. He checked the county recorder's office again to be sure the deed hadn't changed. But that hadn't stopped Patricia Langford and her board from rewriting the narrative. The final piece clicked into place when Vanessa uploaded a screenshot of an internal HOA email she'd received by mistake. It referenced a timeline acceleration and needing to neutralize resistance before the community meeting next month. Graham leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't just overreach, it was a land grab, and he had everything he needed to stop it cold. Graham didn't make a dramatic entrance. That wasn't his style. He reappeared gradually, first at community events, then at HOA meetings, sitting quietly in the back, listening. He never spoke, not at first, just observed, but his presence was felt especially by those on the board who had already begun to treat the lake as their own. Patricia Langford, ever composed in public, started slipping in private. Her voice grew tighter during announcements, her smiles thinner. Rumors spread that the owner of the lake had returned. Some thought it was coincidence. Others whispered it was war. While the board postured, Graham prepared. He and Vanessa compiled records, photographs, satellite images, HOA emails, and legal paperwork into a master file that left no room for ambiguity. A licensed surveyor confirmed the boundaries. Environmental specialists documented the neglected state of the lake under HOA's unofficial control. Trash accumulation, shoreline erosion, phosphate levels from adjacent fertilizer runoff. Graham even installed new cameras facing key access points, not covertly. This time, he wanted them to be seen. Then came the cease and desist letter, elegant, precise, delivered to each board member via courier. It outlined ownership, historical precedents, and clear violations of land use and property misrepresentation. It cited municipal code water rights law and HOA bylaws, many of which the board had quietly broken under Patricia's leadership. He followed it with a private community letter, calm in tone, but unflinching in message. He made no threats, simply stated facts: who he was, what he owned, and what had been done in his absence. It was the kind of truth that didn't need volume, just sunlight. By the following week, murmurs had replaced whispers. Longtime residents began asking questions. Who approved the flyer? Why were there dues funding projects on land not owned by the HOA? Why hadn't they been told? Patricia tried to push back, but the tide was turning. She couldn't quiet what had already been seen, couldn't control what had already been documented. And when Graham stood to speak at the next meeting, steady, composed, backed by pages of evidence, the room didn't fall silent out of politeness. It fell silent out of realization. The real owner was back, and he wasn't going anywhere. Patricia Langford didn't crumble overnight. People like her never do. They deny, redirect, and delay until the walls are closing in from every side. And by the time she finally realized how far the ground had shifted beneath her, there was no place left to stand. The cease and desist had worked its way through every level of the HOA. Some board members ignored it. Others panicked, quietly consulting outside counsel, pretending they had no idea the lake had never belonged to the association. But the real pressure came when Graham's second letter, this time hand-delivered to every household, started circulating. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even defensive. It was surgical. He laid out a timeline, ownership records, environmental neglect reports, financial inconsistencies in how dues had been used for lake maintenance on a property the HOA had no right to touch. The kicker: photos of board-hosted events, private parties, club gatherings, exclusive tours, all taking place on land that clearly fell within Graham's deeded territory. People were stunned. And then they were furious. A recall petition was launched less than 48 hours later. Patricia, in an act of predictable arrogance, doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, reserved the community center, and brought in a PR firm. The backdrop was pure theater banners, showing lakefront visions, glossy flyers about unity and shared space, and a microphone flanked by her most loyal allies, most of whom had no idea they were standing on a sinking ship. Graham showed up with one folder, no entourage, no campaign, just facts. He waited in the back, letting her speak first. Her tone was polished and poised until someone in the crowd asked the question she wasn't prepared to answer. Why were dues funding development plans for land that didn't belong to the HOA? She stammered, deflected, blamed confusion in records. That's when Graham stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He read aloud excerpts from the original developer's agreement, showing that the HOA's access rights had never included ownership or construction privileges. He passed out copies of tax documents, proving he alone paid property taxes on the lake bed and its 15-foot buffer. Then calmly, he produced the signed deed of transfer and the photographic evidence of unauthorized use. Silence, then murmurs, then applause from the very people who had once bought into Patricia's false narrative. Still, she wasn't done. 2 days later, Graham received a notice from the county inspector's office. A complaint had been filed regarding his cabin's deck structure, alleging code violations and environmental impact. The timing wasn't subtle, but neither was Graham's response. Vanessa filed a counter-complaint with attached footage of Patricia trespassing on his property weeks earlier, clipboard in hand peering through windows with another board member. The footage went viral in the local neighborhood Facebook group, and then came the final blow. A leak, whether intentional or not. Someone on the board released internal emails showing Patricia had knowingly pushed a vote to approve lakefront development, even after being warned the property wasn't HOA owned. The emails referred to Graham obliquely, calling him a speed bump and a temporary obstacle. The board resigned en masse 3 days later. Graham didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Instead, he met with residents quietly, respectfully, and proposed the creation of a stewardship trust, one that would allow controlled community use of the lake while preserving its environmental integrity and respecting the rights of the actual landowner. There would be fishing days, student ecology programs, and yes, space for quiet recreation. But no more HOA parties with wine bars and catered buffets on someone else's land. For the first time in a long while, the lake was still, and the quiet didn't feel like defeat. It felt like restoration. The weeks after Patricia's collapse felt oddly still, like standing in the eye of a storm that had finally spun itself out. No more violation letters tucked under my door. No inspectors just doing their job. No neighbors pretending not to see me as they passed. What remained was quieter but more honest. The lake was mine. That was no longer up for debate, but I didn't want it just for me, so I followed through on what I'd promised from the beginning. What this had always really been about. With Vanessa's help, we formalized the Stillwater Stewardship Trust. It wasn't just a legal body, it was a symbol. It allowed for responsible, structured access to the lake for residents who respected its history and health. No yachts, no parties, no fake authority, just people and water. And the kind of peace that doesn't ask permission. I kept my grandfather's boat tied up on the same old dock, fixed the bent rail that had bugged me since spring, and added a small plaque near the stern. It read, "Not everything that floats needs your approval." It made me smile every time I saw it. Patricia, she vanished from the HOA spotlight in the most poetic way imaginable. Her name came off the website. Her pink flyers stopped showing up in mailboxes. Last I heard, she listed her home and left town, chased not by scandal or protest, but by the quiet shame of being found out. No one threw her a going-away party. Vanessa and I stayed in touch. She helped structure the educational programs. We dreamed up school field trips to learn about native plant restoration, summer ecology workshops, even weekend cleanup events. People showed up, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. That was the difference. One evening, I sat on the end of the dock, watching a father teach his daughter how to cast. She was awful at it, but she laughed every time the line tangled. And he laughed too. That's when I knew we'd won. Not because we crushed anyone, but because we rebuilt what mattered. I didn't set out to change a community. I just wanted to be left alone. Funny how sometimes doing the right thing for yourself ends up being the right thing for everyone else too. And Stillwater, it's never been quieter. In the best possible way. It's a funny thing, really, how a single letter in your mailbox can unravel everything you thought was settled, and at the same time, reveal everything you needed to remember. When I first stood on that dock, with Patricia Thornfield's violation notice crumpled in my hand, I didn't know what kind of war I was walking into. I wasn't chasing a fight. I wasn't looking to make headlines or lead a neighborhood rebellion. I just wanted to protect something simple, something sacred, quiet mornings, rippling water. The memory of a grandfather who believed the land meant more than money. But sometimes standing still is its own kind of resistance. Sometimes you don't have to march. You don't have to shout. You just have to not move, not give in, not give up, not back down. Stillwater Lake taught me that. So did Patricia Thornfield in her own way. People like her, the ones obsessed with control, masked as order. They always count on one thing: your silence. They build their empires on the assumption that no one will read the fine print, that no one will ask the hard questions, that people will just pay the fine and keep their heads down. But what they forget is this: all it takes is one person to say no. One person with the documents, one person with the time, one person with the will, and the whole house of cards comes down. I don't think of myself as a hero. I didn't change the world. I didn't rewrite laws or lead some national movement. But in this corner of the map, on this lake, in this town, I helped remind people that ownership doesn't mean exclusion, and community doesn't mean obedience. Vanessa once told me that stewardship is a form of love, not romantic love, not even the kind you share with family. It's the quiet, long-haul kind of love, the kind that builds trails no one else will walk, fixes fences no one sees fall, and defends the water line even when no one's watching. That's what this place deserves. That's what every place deserves. When kids dip their feet into the lake, Now they don't know what happened here. They don't know the paperwork, the meetings, the late-night strategy sessions. They don't know about the woman in the pink tracksuit, or the zoning threats, or the forged violations. And that's fine. What they know is that the water is clear, that frogs still croak in the reeds, that if they bring a pole and a hook, someone will show them how to cast. Maybe that's all the legacy I need. If you're watching this because you've got your own HOA tyrant to deal with, or your own piece of land someone thinks they can take, just remember you're not powerless. Know the rules better than they do. Hold your ground longer than they expect. And when the moment comes, when they try to write you out of your own story, write yourself back in with ink, with law, with the lake behind you. Stillwater didn't change me. It reminded me, and I'll never forget again.